forward on this.
Cloud where it will. In cloud, where does it upload?
Test. Test. Testing.
Very bright.
Just checking it. If you stand over here, you can see the audience. Yes. So they want to get up and step over there and talk about it.
Yeah.
Yeah, that would be great. Thank you.
Yeah.
Good. The chairs are
All right. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Canadian Museum for Human Rights. My name is Kevin Wolpak. I'm a high school social studies teacher in Selkirk, Manitoba, past president of the Manitoba Social Science Teachers Association. Yes, shout out to my students and colleague in the front rows here. Before we begin, I'd like to just get started with a land acknowledgement. So the Canadian Museum for Human Rights is located on Indigenous ancestral lands on Treaty 1 territory. The Red River Valley is also the birthplace of the Métis. We acknowledge that the water in the museum comes from Shoal Lake and are grateful to the First Nations that care for that water. This evening, we have a great group of panelists here to be discussing the path to global nuclear disarmament, the intersectionality of human rights and nuclear proliferation, and the collective role we play in shaping nuclear weapons-free future. And just if you could allow me 1 minute just to talk about how for the last 2 days, we've had a great group of students here from all across the province and elsewhere, the United States as well, who have been doing a lot of great work on working towards nuclear peace. And so a big shout out to all those students that are still here after all those hours you put in. Well done. Yeah, absolutely. And just a couple of housekeeping details before we get started. The washrooms, if you need them, are located just behind you, I believe on both sides, close to the just before you get to the little shop. And there is a restaurant on site for anyone who may need a quick break for refreshment during the event. So it is my pleasure and honor to introduce you to our panel tonight. I'd like to start with Dr. Ira Helfand. Dr. Helfand is the immediate past president of the International Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War, who are the recipients of the 1985 Nobel Peace Prize. He is also co-founder and past president of Physicians for Social Responsibility. He's a Harvard-educated physician and internationally recognized peace advocate. Welcome, Dr. Helfand. This way. Kaz Iguchi is an English language teacher at Kansai Soka High School in Osaka, Japan. He is also the coordinator of Learning Cluster, a global citizenship program conducted in English. Kaz is a student at DePaul University in value creating education for global citizenship. Welcome, Kaz. The Honorable Mary Lou McPhedran, Senator Mary Lou McPhedran, is a human rights lawyer, professor, and activist, and was appointed as an independent senator in the Parliament of Canada by Governor General David Johnston on the recommendation of Prime Minister Justin Trudeau in November 2016. Welcome, Senator McPhedran. This way again. Franco Escobar is a PhD student at Keele University's David Bruce Center for the Study of the Americas in the UK. His research focuses on youth involvement in transnational networks for nuclear disarmament. The project was first conceived during his time as a Fulbright Scholar at the Joan B. Clark School of Peace Studies at the University of San Diego in California in May of 2023. Welcome, Franco. And finally, to introduce our moderator for the evening, Dr. Kauser Ahmed is an educator and researcher in peace and conflict studies who has an in-depth understanding of social conflict and its peaceful transformation. He's an adjunct professor at the University of Winnipeg and the University of Manitoba. He leads two not-for-profit organizations in Winnipeg, Manitoba, and I'm very happy to say I've been able to collaborate with Dr. Ahmed on some great work that we recently released. So it's a pleasure to welcome you here, Dr. Ahmed. And so with that, I will hand it off to you and have a great evening.
Thank you, Kevin, for a warm welcome. Dear audience, ladies and gentlemen, it's such a warm privilege here today with a very knowledgeable panelist, and I feel really grateful to have the privilege of moderating this session. Before I begin, let me do my tricky acknowledgement. We all are here sitting in the land of Anishinaabe, Cree, Ojibwe, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and on the original lands of Métis Nation. We all are promise-bound to work together in the true spirit of truth and reconciliation. Dear audience, today we have gathered here for a very special occasion and the discussion on the topic freeing the world from nuclear weapons. And this is such an important issue that is existential in nature. And this is why we have just try to invite scholars, activists, and policymakers to understand what is going on in terms of the proliferation and the prohibition of nuclear weapons. Our goal tonight is to explore, understand, and reflect on the impact of nuclear weapons on our world and to discuss the pathways towards disarmament and peace. We'll be hearing from our speakers, asking them questions, and also opening up the floor for you, the audience, to engage in this critical dialogue. So without further ado, let me speak a little bit about the plan of moderation today. What I would like to do is to invite our esteemed speakers to speak for about 7 to 8 minutes each, and we'll follow a sequence, of course. And then I would go into a moderated Q&A session, and I have prepared some questions for all of you, and I will go through those. And then again, I will open up for the question and answer session from you, audience, because I see a lot of young people here this evening, and this gives me a lot of hope for for the future. So we are eagerly waiting to hear your perspective and how you engage our esteemed speakers. The audience, I would like to follow the sequence. First, I would like to invite our own and Honorable Senator Meryl McFadden to give her opening remarks, and we'd like to hear from her, especially her take on Canada's role in TPNW. And after that, we'd welcome Dr. Ila Helfand, and then I would request Mr. Our friend from Japan, Kazuhiro Iguchi, and finally Franco. So that is the sequence I would like to follow. So without further ado, the audience, ladies and gentlemen, it's a privilege to welcome Honorable Senator Marilu McFadden.
Thank you, everyone, for taking the time to come out on a Friday night. Salute to the students who came back after 2 days in this hall working with us. And before I start my remarks, I want to do a bit of a surprise introduction of two of my guests tonight and tell you a little bit about having met them actually for the first time in the Senate chamber in Ottawa just a few weeks ago. There is something called the 1834 Fellowship, and it was started some years ago by a group of women, Black women, who have founded Operation Black Vote Canada. And as some of you in this room know, I sponsor a bill in the Senate for lowering the federal voting age to 16. So pretty much anything that relates to voting rights attracts my attention. And the 1834 fellows were in Ottawa. These are very accomplished young Black leaders in Canada. 1834 is the year that finally slavery was officially abolished. And one of the members of my team in my office is an 1834 fellow. And she came up to me, she said, Senator, we've got two 1834 fellows from Manitoba. And I said, I've got to meet them, and I'm so pleased that they're my guests tonight. If I could ask Reem and El Shaddai to stand up for just a moment, please. So to the topic at hand. I hope I don't take up all of the time. I'm hoping that we can create some question and answer and commentary time. I have been so honored and moved to be here in this room for the better part of the last 2 days, because we've had over 50 high school students with their teachers working nonstop on the whole question of the future of humanity and threat of nuclear weapons. Now, I come at this issue typically as a human rights lawyer. And so when I hear the Secretary General of the United Nations at the opening of the 78th UN General Assembly just a few weeks ago say that we are in a time of utter madness for the escalation of the threats of using nuclear weapons, and we also know the actual escalation of somehow producing more efficient killing nuclear weapons, even though we already know that we have about 12,000 of them, and we only need 2 to wipe everybody and everything out. So I think the Secretary General of the UN has really captured the challenge. The challenge is how do sane people deal with this madness? And one of the key points that was made over and over again in our discussions yesterday and today with student leaders is that very seldom do you ever get initial leadership from governments. Governments respond. Parliamentarians respond. And we respond to those who are active and thoughtful and incredibly determined to break through all the various barriers that are out there for reaching to governments, to parliaments, to legislators, to lawmakers to say, this has got to change. And my feeling yesterday and today was that I'm sitting with the leaders and that the leadership to a large extent in this country is situated right here. It's the community-based leadership from organizations that have come together to co-host the students for the third year for the Youth Nuclear Peace Days. And it's the networking that is represented in this room. If we were to map who's connected here and the different organizations that you are involved in and you represent, we would be tied together in like some kind of new web with multiple connections. And seeing everyone here tonight, including many of you with whom I've had the great privilege of working over the years on various issues, not issues related to nuclear weapons per se, but issues about human security, safety, dignity, ethics. And I think most of all, what I'm struggling with about the decision by the current government of Canada to have nothing to do with the treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons, I'm struggling with the ethics of that. Not about any, I don't belong to any political party. I'm an independent senator. And so it's not about towing any kind of party line or trying to score any points in a partisan political setting. This is about being a global citizen, living in Manitoba, and caring about the future of humanity, the functioning capacity of our civilizations on this planet. And so the anecdote I wanted to share before I turn this over is that on November 20th and 21st in Ottawa, actually in Senate of Canada rooms, there's going to be the first ever Youth Parliament Nuclear Summit. And it's happening. Let me assure you that the youth who managed to make it to Ottawa are not coming because they've been invited by the government of Canada. They're coming because civil society organizations like the Simons Foundation, Reverse the Trend, Project Plowshares, Minds Actions Canada have joined with 5 women parliamentarians. And together with the NDP Foreign Affairs critic Heather McPherson, the co-leader of the Green Party of Canada, Elizabeth May, the Deputy Whip of the NDP in Parliament in the House of Commons, Lindsay Matheson, and on the Senate side, my sister Senator Kim Pate and myself. The 5 of us have just decided to convene the Youth Parliament Nuclear Summit, because it's long past time for parliamentarians to hear directly from young leaders in this country, and the power of the movement that we're part of is because it is international, it is intergenerational, and it is intersectional, and that's the strength. And so I'm delighted to see every one of you here this evening, and I'm looking forward to hearing what my co-panelists have to say.
Thank you so much, Senator. It's such an encouraging news that we have the summit coming up in Ottawa. So we look forward to hearing from Ottawa what is happening with the whole process itself. The audience, now it's time to hear from Dr. Ila Elfand, and you have already gotten his bio. But I would particularly request Dr. Ira to kindly reflect upon his motivation and medical perspective of the prohibition of the nuclear weapon. And with this bit of request, let me welcome Dr. Ira.
Senators, thanks to you all for coming out this evening. This is not an easy thing that we've come to talk about. And we're living in a particularly difficult moment. We've just come out of the worst pandemic in a century. We're living through a year which has demonstrated, I think beyond any doubt, the enormity of the challenge and threat we face from the climate crisis. There are two terrible wars going on in Ukraine, in the Middle East, and many other conflicts around the planet at this time. And on top of all of this, we need to deal with the question of nuclear war. And it's not supposed to be like this. We're not supposed to have this problem anymore. Looking out, I see many people in this audience who clearly remember the end of the Cold War and the enormous sense of relief we all felt that we had dodged the bullet, that we had gotten through that terrible confrontation between East and West without nuclear weapons being used. And I think we all decided at that point we weren't going to worry about this anymore. It was such a relief to have this weight off of our shoulders. We were just going to put it out of mind. And we did. And that was a mistake because the problem didn't really go away. Things got better a bit in the 90s, but thousands of nuclear warheads remained. And 12,000 at this point. And they were just sort of sitting there waiting for things to go bad again. And they've gone bad. Relations between NATO, the United States on the one side, and Russia on the other, are the worst they've been since the end of the Cold War. And they've been that bad even before the invasion of Ukraine, which has made things immeasurably more dangerous. And there are other important flashpoints in the world. The rivalry between the United States and China could also lead to a war that involves nuclear weapons. The ongoing conflict between India and Pakistan and South China and South Asia could lead to a war that involves escalation to nuclear weapons. And in that situation, we have to understand that this is not some historical phenomenon that we're talking about. This is a real and present danger. And we have to understand the magnitude of that danger. What's going to happen if we have a nuclear war? And I think that also is something which we have forgotten, people of my generation, and which young people have never been taught. And it's worse than we think. Many of us have images in our mind of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. These are very powerful warnings of what nuclear weapons can do, but they do not begin to prepare us for what will happen if there's a nuclear war today. We're not talking about one or two Hiroshima-sized bombs falling on one or two cities. We're talking about many weapons on many cities, most of which will be anywhere from 6 to 50 times more powerful than the bomb that destroyed Hiroshima. The immediate fatalities from a nuclear war between the United States and Russia would probably amount to over 200 million people dead in an afternoon. The entire economic infrastructure of both countries, and of Canada and Europe, if NATO was involved in the war, will be destroyed. None of the things that we depend on to keep ourselves alive will remain. There'll be no internet, no cell phones, no public health system, no food distribution system. And most of the people living in the countries that fight this war, who don't die on the first day, will also die in the coming months from starvation, from radiation poisoning, from epidemic disease, from exposure. In addition, and perhaps even more worrisome, we now know with a high degree of certainty that a nuclear war between the United States and NATO on the one side and Russia on the other will produce a nuclear winter. A study that was published last year showed that the expected effects of this war would be to drop global temperatures across the planet an average of 10 degrees centigrade. In the interior regions of North America, places like here in Winnipeg, and in the interior regions of Eurasia, temperatures will drop 25 to 30 degrees centigrade. That's colder than the coldest moment of the last ice age. And under those conditions, all the ecosystems that have evolved since the end of that ice age will collapse. food production across the planet will stop. And according to the study that was published last year, at least 3/4 of the human race, between 5 and 6 billion people, will starve to death in the first 2 years following that war, and the famine will continue beyond that. The study didn't look into the out years. That same study also found that even a much more limited war, as might take place between India and Pakistan, would cause enough climate disruption to trigger a famine that would kill about 2 billion people, a quarter of humanity in the first 2 years, including the vast majority of the population here in Canada and about a third of the population in the United States. It is very hard for us to put our arms around these facts, but we must do that. This is not the plot of the movie that I've just been describing. This is the danger we are living with every day, that we allow these weapons to continue to exist. And this is what is going to happen if we continue on the path that we are currently on. We are not here today because we know what we're doing, because we have wise leaders and sound doctrine and infallible technology. We're here in the assessment of former Defense Secretary, U.S. Defense Secretary Robert McNamara, because, I'm quoting him, we lucked out. It was luck that prevented nuclear war. And we have to understand that the nuclear policy of all 9 nuclear-armed countries and their allies, like Canada, that policy today is nothing more than a hope for continued good luck, which is an utterly insane basis for national security policy. Our luck will not last indefinitely. If we don't get rid of these weapons, the horrible things I've talked about are going to happen. Now, the good news is that this is not the future that must be. Nuclear weapons are not a force of nature over which we have no control. It is not as though an asteroid is coming to this planet and there's nothing we can do about it. These are little machines that we've built with our own hands. They're about the size of the chairs that you're sitting in. We've dismantled more than 50,000 of them already. We know exactly how to dismantle the 12,000 that remain, and we can do it in about 5 years if we make that decision. The problem is that our leaders have not made that decision. They are acting as though they are in control of the situation when they're not. They're acting as though these weapons make us safe in some way when they are in fact the greatest threat to our safety, to our security, and to our survival. And we need to convince them, and we need to pressure them, we need to force them to do the right thing, which is to get rid of these weapons once and for all. And the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons provides a pathway for doing that. And for people living here in Canada, I think the task is really clear. We need to create pressure on the government in Ottawa to sign and ratify this treaty, and to use that ratification to put pressure on the United States and the other nuclear-armed countries. And each one of us has an absolutely critical role to play in this, because unless we all get involved, it isn't going to happen. None of us is going to do this all by ourselves. But each one of us has to do that part of the job which is ours to do. And if we do that, I think we can be very optimistic. In the 1980s, 1983, the US deployed missiles in Europe with a stated intent of being able to fight and win a nuclear war against the Soviet Union. It was a totally insane proposition, but it was US policy. Less than 2 years later, Reagan and Gorbachev sat down together and said nuclear war could never be won and must never be fought. It was a complete reversal of the nuclear policy that had brought us to the brink of war in '83. And it was done in 2 years' time. And there's no reason why we cannot repeat the success which the anti-nuclear movement enjoyed in the 1980s. We just have to get ourselves in motion. We have to take action, and we have to behave as responsible global citizens. And if we do that, we're going to save the world. And that's going to be a pretty great thing for all of us to do. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Year. It's such a wealth of insights that you shared with us, especially the number of weapons that we have stockpiled over decades. And I'm sure you have heard from him about, even if you start dismantling it, it will take years to actually bring it to zero. Thank you so much once again. The audience, let's move to our third speaker today, Mr. Kazuhiro Iguchi. And as you all know, he's our friend from Japan. And we are going to hear from him his insights, and particularly, I will be requesting him about reflecting on two aspects, if you can, about bridging cultures and the role of education in disarmament awareness. Kazuhiro, the floor is yours, sir.
Thank you. Good evening, everybody. Thank you so much. It's certainly not easy bringing somebody from Japan to join you today, so I'd like to wholeheartedly thank the organizers of this event, and for you for participating, coming all the way here, and for those who are joining from Zoom, thank you so much. My name is Kaz Iguchi. I am an English teacher at Kansai Soka High School. I also run a program called Learning Cluster with a group of 6 different teachers that teaches global issues in English. And I am, I think, maybe the hope aspect of this panel because I work with young people. I work with the future. So today I hope to share and discuss and learn through our panel discussion the role of education and what it has the power to do to rid our world free of nuclear weapons. Just to give you a little bit about my background, because not all Japanese people can speak English like this. I grew up in Toronto. I did my education there from K to 12 in Canada. And I also actually went through Waldorf education, for those who are familiar with that. It's an educational philosophy by Rudolf Steiner. So my high school education was based on Steiner education. And then I went back to Japan and studied at Soka University, where I encountered Soka education, which Soka stands for value creating. So value creating pedagogy for the first time. And that is what I'm getting a degree in right now, value creating education for global citizenship. So having experienced these different kind of ways to learn, I became very interested in the impact that education has in creating human character. And so as AI progresses, I think we will be asked this question more and more about what makes us uniquely human. What is it about us? And I think this gives clue to how we can rid these nuclear weapons, because it cannot just be about logic. We cannot just be knowledgeable about the issue, but we need a poetic spirit to actually feel what happened to these people below the bomb, to make it feel more human. And so I think education really has the power to do that. And just to share a little bit about Soka education for those who are hearing it for the first time, this educational philosophy started in the early 1900s, just before the war of World War II, by 2 educators, Tsunesaburo Makiguchi and Josei Toda. And they were school teachers, and Makiguchi was later a principal, and they firmly believed that education was for the happiness of the child. This is a very simple concept, but yet very profound when we think about the historical context, because education at that time was heading towards World War II, where they were using education to educate students to become loyal soldiers who would be willing to risk their life for the war, because they believed that the emperor was a living god. This fallacy, it's hard to believe, but if you're educated like this, then you can risk your life for this cause. So Makiguchi and Toda opposed to the war through their educational belief that education really is for the happiness of the child and not education for the nation. They were imprisoned and they were thought by the fascist war regime at that time as thought criminals. They were imprisoned. Makiguchi, unfortunately, died in prison, and his disciple Josei Toda came out of prison alive. And seeing Japan in the ruins of nothing left behind, Josei Toda embarked on bringing forth these values of value-creating pedagogy into society through his movement of the Soka Kyoiku Gakkai, which will later evolve into SGI, which is Soka Gakkai International. Just before he passed away, Josei Toda made an anti-nuclear declaration in which he said he would like to rip out the claws that lie hidden in these weapons. And what he was referring to was not nuclear weapons per se, but the human nature of evil that resides in each and every human being to justify that we can use these weapons and to create our own happiness upon the misfortune of others. This statement, I think, is very significant and very relevant in today's world because it's not political. It's that every human being possesses in them this sort of evil that can justify these weapons. So the anti-nuclear movement can become a practice. And I think that's what he was aiming for. And Toda would later meet a young man named Daisaku Ikeda, who would carry on Makiguchi and Toda's vision and spread their philosophy into the fields of peace, culture, and education. And so Daisaku Ikeda is the founder of my school, Kansai Soka High School, and all of the Soka schools that are around the world, actually, all the way from kindergarten to university. So we have 15 different Soka schools around the world, and it's growing. He mentioned that at our school and all the Soka schools, we strive to foster global citizens. And you might think, what is a global citizen? He outlined a global citizen with these three conditions: the wisdom to perceive the interconnectedness of all life, the courage not to fear or deny difference, but to respect and strive to understand people of different cultures and to grow from encounters with them. The compassion to maintain an imaginative empathy that reaches beyond one's immediate surroundings and extends to those suffering in distant places. So in short, wisdom, courage, and compassion. And once again, these qualities also resides in each and every one of us, and this can become a practice. We can practice on becoming a more passionate, a more wiser, more courageous person. And so this is what it means to be a global citizen. And at Kansai Soka High School, we also cherish this motto that was given by Daisaku Ikeda, our founder, at our opening ceremony in 1973. He said that we should never build our own happiness upon the misfortune of others. I'm going to repeat that. We cannot create our own happiness upon the misfortune of others. Again, my students and also teachers and everybody involved in my school, we also try to practice this in our daily life through our educational experience. And so this practice of that motto and about global citizenship is where, in which my my school treasures. And in the conversations that we've been having at the Nuclear Summit, Dr. Halfand mentioned that we need to get rid of nuclear weapons immediately, and that we don't have so much time. So he used this analogy that when a person goes to the hospital, we need to immediately stop the bleeding. So that's the political side of nuclear weapons, I think. But in the long run, we need to fix the real problem, which is the human spirit that I've been talking to you about. And I think that the true purpose of education can really serve this role. And so that's what I would like to contribute in the discussion that we're going to have. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Kazuhiro, for your, I think, a wonderful philosophy. It's resonating in my mind as well. I am sure many of you you cannot build your happiness upon one's misfortune. Thank you so much for mentioning it today. We'll be with our last panel speaker today, and Franco, floor is yours. Go ahead. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Hi, everyone. A little bit of context about myself. I'm a PhD student, originally from Puebla, Mexico, but I'm studying in Kiel University in the UK. And I first got into, studying nuclear weapons about a year ago. And I'm a political scientist and a sociologist by training. And what that means is that when we try to study social movements and nuclear weapons, one of the things we're trying to do is observe and measure power, right? And at this event, actually at the Youth Summit, one of the words that is in the motto of the summit is empowering. The other two are engage and enact. But when I saw that there was a youth peace, nuclear peace summit, I thought I have to go and see how youth are being empowered. And so I thought that one of the things I could share with you is more or less how, from a sociological point of view, as someone who studies social movements is trying to observe what's happening here. And, you can think that there's a simple way of seeing power when it comes to nuclear weapons. One of them is, some countries have them, some others don't. Those who have them are powerful, those who do not are not. But when you look at scholars who study power, there are actually three dimensions, and I think I can summarize it in one sentence, which is power is not a cake, it is a relationship. And I'll explain in just a second, but basically, one dimension of power is how does one convince another person or an actor to do something that they would not otherwise do, right? So in this case, is how do you convince a nuclear power to sign the taking of the treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons, right? Some people would say, well, you need money, you need people, you need to protest, you might need good marketing and framing, delivering the right messages, etc. Right? Another dimension of power, the second one that sociologists study, is who has a seat at the table where decisions are being made, right? So perhaps you have the money, the message, the people, the right ideas, but maybe you don't have a seat at the UN. Maybe you don't have a seat in parliament. And so even with all of the resources and ideas you have, you might still feel powerless because you can't get them to the right place, right? And then the third dimension of power is basically mind control. And I'll explain why in a second, but this is why I decided to come to Winnipeg. The third dimension of power, as studied by sociologists, is the technical term is regimes of truth. But what that means is what do we understand to be normal and real? And so in the case of nuclear weapons, one regime of truth is that some of us have been convinced that we need them to sustain peace, right? Some of us have been convinced also that nuclear disarmament is impossible, that it's too idealistic, right? And so when I was in the UK and I heard about a group of people in Winnipeg, Manitoba, who were challenging this idea, right, that nuclear disarmament is impossible, and that they were going to meet for 2 days. And not just that, they were going to be young people, they were going to be youth, some of which are, in fact, disempowered by how ideas are calcified into institutions. For instance, people under a certain age cannot vote, cannot run for office. And so when I decided to come here, I thought I need to go and see how these people, young or old, from different backgrounds, are harnessing power and building relationships, right? Since power is not this zero-sum game in which the cake, right? If I gain more power, you lose it. It's not like that. It's this relationship where if I gain power as a young person, you might as well as an older person, because we all benefit from not living in a world where, we're aiming nukes at each other. So more or less, I decided to come here, and in the next 3 years, my aim is to see who are these people who are challenging this idea about nuclear weapons. And I'm very grateful for the people who have enabled me to be here with you all today. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Welcome to Winnipeg, always. Thank you. The audience, we are now at the second part of our session today, which is sort of moderated question and answer. So I would like to express my gratitude to Mr. Avinash for preparing with a set of questions. So I'm going to follow some of those because we don't have enough time to actually round up all the questions for our esteemed panelists. However, there are some common questions that I'd like to first start with. Then maybe I would go with some specific questions to specific speakers. So first, I would like to start with a very general question, but I think these questions are super important for general people like all of us to understand the reason why we are gathered here today this evening. So the question is something like that. How does the presence of nuclear weapon impacts the global peace and security? And for an average person, why he or she should be concerned with the nuclear weapons today? So this is the general question I'd like to start with today in this part with all these panelists. And I'd like to start with Honorable Senator as we started our session with her. So Senator, what do you think? Why should somebody be bothered about the presence of nuclear weapon today?
I think we need to be bothered because our government, to a large extent, is not. I think we need to be bothered because we lack leadership on this crucial issue for the survival of all humanities, all species, all everything. And somehow the madness that was referred to by the UN Secretary General, to which I referred earlier, has been normalized. And it's a very strange experience to be in Ottawa and to have numerous conversations with numerous government officials, including ministers, and get the blank look. I asked a group of young activists also, why is this not on your list of things that you'll take to the streets? And I have a great deal of respect for these young activists. One of them happens to be born to me. And they came back and said, it's too big. It's too big. We can take to the streets on housing. We can take to the streets on food security. We can take to the streets on racial injustice. But this is just such a huge, terrifying concept. The entire annihilation of everything that exists, that it's too big. So I think that if we don't continue, because this isn't a starting point, you folks would not be here on a Friday night if you weren't already way ahead of most of those in government who think about things that need to be done that are a priority. And I think that it's a deep gut instinct to know that this is madness. And the sanity that needs to be brought to this is going to have to come from so-called ordinary people who are prepared to take extraordinary, determined, tenacious, Never give up action on this.
I have a slightly different take on this. I think there clearly is a sense that this is a huge and overwhelming problem. But I think the real problem is the denial that people are in that this problem exists at all. And I think that's why we need to be attentive to this issue, because we need to break through that denial. For most people, this isn't even on their radar screen, you know, and clearly when we talk to people about it, it's very important that we provide not just a clear analysis of the threat, but also a clear path to dealing with the threat. Because if you're just afraid of something, that is paralyzing, that does overwhelm you. But we saw in the 1980s when literally millions of people in Canada, the United States, in Europe, in Australia, Japan, even the Soviet Union, took extended and vigorous political action to change nuclear policy at a time when the threat was at least as overwhelming in their view, that people will act on this if they understand the danger and if they see a way forward. And we may come to a point where the primary thing holding people back is a sense of being overwhelmed by the danger. But I think at the current moment, the bigger problem is that people just don't understand the danger that we face. You know, this is especially true for young people who we have failed. We've not educated them about this. When I go to college campuses, if I'm meeting with a small group of people, I will hand out a piece of paper and ask them to write down, before I say anything, how many nuclear weapons do you think there are in the world? And the response I usually get is in single numbers. The range is never greater than 200. There are 12,000. And when I tell people there are 12,000, the reaction isn't that, oh my God, I can't deal with this. It's, oh my God, why wasn't I told? And I think that's hopeful to me. I think if we give people, young people, the information, and if we remind older people of the information that they once knew, we'll get the response that we need. It is very difficult though. It's hard for people to believe this information even when they hear it, even when they know intellectually that this is true. I mean, the data is quite clear about the number of warheads, what's going to happen if they're used, how close we've come to war before, and so on. But there's a difference between knowing this and believing this. And I think we need to get to a point where people not only know in the abstract the danger posed by nuclear weapons, but believe in their gut that this is going to happen if we don't do something about it. And that, I think, is the real challenge for us. When people come to an event like this, you get a certain amount of information. It may sound very compelling. You may be very convinced that there's an urgent need to do something about a nuclear war. When you go home, you're probably not going to hear about nuclear weapons for weeks again. That's changed a little bit since the Ukraine war. But still, you're not going to hear very much. And as time goes by, the natural inclination, I think, is to think, well, those people on the panel said it was very compelling. It sounded very convincing. But if things are really that bad, wouldn't I be reading about this every day in the newspapers, hearing about it every day on the television? So part of the problem is just getting, I think, to a critical mass of people raising their voices so that this message gets reinforced continuously in a way that enables us to actually believe it.
I think the reason why we're all here is because we like to learn something and figure out what we can do. And I think it is really creating this connection, this relationship with this issue through our interest, which is the first part. I'd like to share with you a comment which one of my students wrote after she came back from our trip from Hiroshima. She says, I learned many important things through Hiroshima fieldwork. First, my views of nuclear weapons have changed. Before going on the fieldwork, I learned about nuclear deterrence theory, and I was somewhat convinced. Although I knew how inhumane nuclear weapons are, I couldn't refute against the idea. However, through hearing the testimonies of Hibakshas, visiting the Hiroshima Peace Memorial Museum, and listening to the poems of survivors, I was disgusted that we can justify having weapons that has the power to make people suffer this much. A world that has such weapons exist is like letting evil exist. This made me realize that international security that depends on threat is not correct, and that true international security should be based on trust. So I just wanted to share that with you. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I think that the reason why we should all care about nuclear weapons has to do with the problem of human extinction. And the first time that the scientific community agreed about the possibility of complete human annihilation was in the 1850s, when scientists realized that because of the second law of thermodynamics, the sun was eventually gonna, freeze, and that meant that life on Earth was gonna inevitably become impossible to sustain, right? But in a very, very long term into the future, then came nuclear weapons, and it was not the explosion of a weapon, but instead the nuclear winter that they would cause, that would also, get us into a cloud that would block the sun, and we would be unable to sustain life as well. And then the nuclear weapons made it not only that human extinction was completely possible, but inevitable, but also potentially short term. It could be a possibility, tomorrow, the day after tomorrow, today, perhaps. And then came multiplication of what they call them kill mechanisms, right? So then we have pandemics and biological weapons and climate change and climate change related catastrophes, artificial intelligence, and now we have just so many ways in which human annihilation could happen in the short term, in the long term. And the reason why I think nuclear weapons should be a key priority for every person in the world is because it's also one of the ones that could be easier to solve in the short term if we have the political will to do so, if we have the ability to convince our political representatives to disarm, right? So I think that's the reason.
Thank you very much. The audience now, the particular phase that I would like to run is with specific questions to our esteemed speakers. So I will start with Dr. Ira Helfand first. Sir, we have come to understand that TPNW is one of the latest treaty that we have come up with in terms of nuclear proliferation banning. But for our audience, would you like to give a little bit of explanation about the treaty itself? And do you think UN Security Council has adopted something or is going to do something in the future so that TPNW becomes one of the binding treaties for all the nuclear arsenal holding nations?
So 50 years ago, most of the nations of the world signed on to something called the Non-Proliferation Treaty. And it was a bargain struck between the countries that had nuclear weapons at the time and those that didn't, as you all probably know. An essential part of that bargain was that the countries that didn't have nuclear weapons wouldn't develop them, but the countries that did would engage in good faith negotiations to eliminate their arsenals. For the most part, the non-nuclear nations upheld their part of the bargain, and the nuclear armed states didn't. They've never engaged in serious negotiations to eliminate their arsenals, and after years of stonewalling on their part, many of the countries around the world that don't have nuclear weapons got fed up and decided that it was time to change the rules of the game, and instead of continuing to go just to the Non-Proliferation Treaty and ask the nuclear powers to honor their obligations, they decided to take the obligations which were imposed on all countries to negotiate a nuclear ban treaty seriously. And over the course of several years, in a series of conferences that involved first 120, then 130, then 150 nations, it was decided to negotiate a new treaty that would prohibit not just the use of nuclear weapons, but the possession of nuclear weapons, the building of nuclear weapons, financing of nuclear weapons, the transport of nuclear weapons, or stationing of nuclear weapons on the territory of the countries which signed it. And that treaty was adopted at the United Nations in 2017 by a vote of 422 to 1. It has since been signed by, I think it's 97 to 98 countries and ratified by 69. So it's legally binding in those 69 countries that have formally ratified it. None of the nuclear armed states participated in that process. None of them have signed or ratified the treaty. And that is simply a fact we need to acknowledge. Despite that, the treaty is playing a very important role. It is creating a new norm that nuclear weapons should be illegal, in the same way that chemical weapons are illegal, biological weapons are illegal. And it is putting real pressure on the countries that do have nuclear weapons, which is why they're so upset by the treaty, which they very much are. And I think we need to just realize that the next step needs to be in the countries that actually have the nuclear weapons, and in the countries like NATO nations like Canada that live under the US nuclear umbrella. We need to figure out how to use this treaty, how to leverage it further to create even more pressure on the nuclear armed states to meet their obligations under the existing treaty and to join the new treaty. I don't think the Security Council is going to play a role in this at all. I think this is going to be something which takes place amongst the body politic of the countries which currently have nuclear weapons and their allies like Canada and the other NATO states. And we're the ones that are going to make this treaty work or not. We need to force our governments to do the right thing.
Thank you, sir. Thank you very much. Okay.
I'm hoping I can build on that very excellent answer by referring specifically to some aspects of Canada. You will be familiar with the organization ICANN, the Nuclear Ban Treaty Organization that was awarded the Nobel Prize. And ICANN started a parliamentary pledge and asked parliamentarians around the world if they would sign on to that pledge. And I'm saying this to a Winnipeg audience tonight because it would be wonderful if you wanted to think about whether or not your parliamentarians have signed on to this pledge. It's very simple, but it has a very clear emphasis on what parliamentarians can do. And this is part of the accountability that we as parliamentarians should have to you. So it's very easy to find. You can just go to ICANN, to the website, put in parliamentary pledge. You'll see that it's a signed promise as parliamentarians to work toward the signing and ratification of the Treaty for the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. And we currently have more than 50 Canadian parliamentarians that have signed that pledge. We need more, and we need those that have already signed to be reminded of what they promised.
I had a question for you, but since you already had some discussions about how to sign the petition, so I just wanted to ask you in a question in a way that since you live in Ottawa, you spend a lot of time in Ottawa, you are very close to power. Our question is, what do you think are the reasons for Canada not signing the TPNW? Is it just geopolitics, or is it the lack of political willingness to some extent?
Well, I think we do see a clear lack of political will. And I think we see that lack of political will at the leadership level of the federal government because of pressure, both in the form of NATO and a very rigid policy that's being interpreted in a very rigid way, that it's all or nothing nuclear weapons all the way. That's actually not what the NATO policy says, but that is the interpretation that's being given. And then we also have to remember who lives south of us. And all of the many ways, when you reference me being close to power, forgive me, but I did roll my eyes a little bit. I've actually never felt quite so far away from power as I do when I'm in Ottawa. It's really ironic. I've spent my whole adult life as an activist and an advocate and a human rights lawyer, and I felt for decades that I could pretty much get through to powerful people. And ironically, often as a senator, I don't feel that way. As a senator, I have come to appreciate even more how crucial it is for parliamentarians to hear from and be held accountable by people at home when we come home for gatherings like this. So yes, there is a lack of political will. And the only thing that's going to change that is the messaging and the encouragement and the accountability that people at home require of their parliamentarians.
Such a wonderful response. So let's move back to Kaz. In terms of education, what is currently being taught in Japanese schools and on the World War II nuclear bombardment and nuclear disarmament? And if you kindly also share with us at what grade levels these educations are being imparted.
Okay. As I mentioned before, I was educated mostly in Canada, but from what I am seeing and learning, history, when we learn about history, we often hear that history is written by the victors. I think that history is taught from different perspectives in different countries. It depends where you are in the world. And I recently had one of my students that went to Taiwan and saw a museum there about the history of what Japan did to Taiwan, which has never been taught in Japanese history books. And so she came back and she had learned about all of the heroic history of Japan and was baffled that Japan had its dark history that has never been told in history classes. And I think this is somewhat similar in the sense that we always play the victim when it comes to World War II. And we always approach history as Japan did this and America did that. But that doesn't really do justice to create value from history. We just take sides. So it's very important, I think, to acknowledge. This is actually one project that my students are doing to create. Is it possible to create a universal textbook about history? And so one of my students are embarking on that kind of research. But we approach history by teaching it as a fact. And that's what I said about teaching above the bomb, that what happened above the bomb. But when my students learn about what happened to the people below the bomb, having experiences going to Hiroshima and meeting with the A-bomb survivors, their understanding of history completely changes. And I think in Japan, at all levels, we do take our students to Hiroshima or Nagasaki to have these kind of experiences. And just recently, before I was coming, there was on TV kindergarten students going into the Hiroshima Peace Memorial Museum. I mean, this is very traumatic stuff for kindergarten children to see. But there is a powerful message. It's not just about despair, but there's so much hope that when you meet with these A-bomb survivors, they don't talk about hatred and they don't talk about who is to blame, but they share their story because they don't want anybody, any human being, to experience something as horrible as what they saw and have experienced. And so when it comes to the message of peace, there's no agenda. And that I think that these hibakshas, the A-bomb survivors, really teach us that when everyone in all walks of life can appreciate life and to work for peace together, I think that's the message, the strong message that we can learn from what is happening. And one of the, and one more answer to the question, at what grade level? And so actually, I'm having my students go to elementary school in around February when they complete their research projects to share what they found to elementary school children. Because we make this issue so complicated, but if you can teach elementary school children about this issue, then you really need to understand it and you really need to feel what is at the root of all of this problem. And actually, children do a much better job in understanding because it's about I think children do this so much better than adults. It's about making friendship and not having the bias and overcoming our fear to unite and to work together harmoniously. So I think that as a teacher myself, I learned tremendously from my students about how to be a better human being. So thank you.
Thank you very much. My last question to Franco. Franco, you spoke about power, and I'm very much interested about this topic itself because in UN Security Council we have 5 powerful countries, and out of 5 countries, 3 are democratic countries, G7 nation. So my question is, do you feel optimistic about grassroots level movement, civil society movement, because these movements are less powerful than the powerful states or the leaders who run those states with regards to nuclear disarmament? What do you think?
Yeah, I definitely feel optimistic. There's most of the social movements that have enabled sociologists to theorize about how civil society creates social change have been based on movements where youth have a very important role. If you look at the civil rights movement, Occupy Wall Street, Black Lives Matter, Yo Soy 132 in Mexico, or the Indignados in Spain, and the list goes on, Fridays for Future, and you have now icons of youth activists like Greta Thunberg and many others, where there seems to be a strong drive for social change through protest as a form of engaging with the world that people desire to live in and the change that they want to see in the world. And I think I'm very optimistic to see that sort of engagement with social change because, when we started the 21st century, there were a few scholars who were concerned about civic disengagement. There was this belief that, especially in America, but throughout the world, that people were not voting, people were, even if they had the right to vote, they were not exercising the right. They knew less about, who their representatives were. They didn't care much about their neighbors and the amount of associations that they created, whether for sports or for any other kind of interest that they had, seemed to be more and more solitary, more individualistic. But I think recently with social movements, we've seen this sort of engagement of youth for the issues that they care about, and I think that makes me optimistic.
Thank you so much for being optimistic. The audience, we move to our third part of today's session, and which is session with you and for you. So before I begin, let me once again thank our esteemed panelists for your insightful responses to the questions. We have learned so much from your ideas. So we'll now transition into the session, and we invite our audience to engage directly with our speakers. For those joining us in person, please raise your hand, and there is a microphone somewhere on the floor. I can't see properly because of the light, intense light. So, but there is somewhere, and it will reach you. And for the virtual audience, please type your question, and Avinash will be assisting us in getting the questions. Some of the guidelines, we aim to get through as many questions as possible. So we ask that you keep your questions concise and to the point. Please state your name and affiliation before you ask any question. And if your question is directed towards a specific panelist, please mention their name. Otherwise, any of the speakers may respond. And in the interest of time, to allow diversity of questions, we may not be able to take all the follow-up questions. So it's a huge guideline, but nonetheless, if you can remember half of it, I'm happy. So go ahead. Oh, yeah, just introduce yourself first, okay? Go ahead.
Hello, my name is Eddie Lachey. I'm from Burbank, California. I wanted to ask that once we abolish nuclear weapons, we will still know how to make them. And I'm concerned with that even if we don't have these weapons, we're still gonna go back to our tendencies of going to conflict, going in war. And I wanted to ask you guys, how do you think we go about abolishing something like war, which is a vicious cycle that we're stuck in, which I think is under the root of even the issue of nuclear weapons? Thank you.
Do you have any panelist in mind, particularly?
Anyone?
Anyone? Okay.
That's a very tough question, Eddie. And I don't think I have an answer. I don't think probably any of us do. I think it's an absolute prerequisite to abolish nuclear weapons because we're not going to be here to deal with the broader question of abolishing war. I think the one thing that I can say that might be helpful in this regard is that the process of abolishing nuclear weapons is going to require a degree of cooperation amongst the great powers that could serve as a model for their conduct going forward. I usually think of this in terms of the climate crisis, where the great powers have not been cooperating either. It's a more complicated problem. Getting rid of nuclear weapons is actually relatively simple. But the cooperation, the cooperative relationships that develop in the process of eliminating those weapons could be a model for dealing with the climate crisis. And they could perhaps be a model for more generalized cooperation amongst countries. You know, in the past, we used to urge that nations cooperate rather than fight, rather than compete, largely from, I think, an idealistic perspective. This was the right thing to do, it was the good thing to do. I think we are in a position today to advocate for that kind of cooperation from a purely practical point of view. Because if the countries, the major powers of the world in particular, don't start cooperating, we're not going to get out of this situation alive. And so it's really not a nice thing anymore or a good thing. It's a necessary thing. And perhaps that will be the realization that leads countries to create relationships that don't involve war.
You may experience me as speaking a bit more frequently, but I just want to point out that this is my way of contributing to the gender balance on this panel. I want to answer that by asking a question back, and that is, are you familiar with the Einstein-Russell Manifesto on nuclear weapons?
A little bit, yes.
So for those who are not, in the Cold War, back in the 1950s, two of the most famous men in the world led a movement for scientists to respond to the threat of nuclear weapons in the context of just mere years before that, the devastation with the A-bombs that we've already heard about on Japan. And that became known as the Russell-Einstein Manifesto. And I'm going to just very briefly quote from part of it, because that in turn led to invitations to various scientists, including Oppenheimer, and maybe I could have a show of hands how many people have seen Oppenheimer, who declined, not because he disagreed, but because he wanted to go his own way. But this is a very short excerpt from that manifesto. We have to learn to think in a new way. We have to learn to ask ourselves not what steps can be taken to give military victory to whatever group we prefer, for there no longer are such steps. The question we have to ask ourselves is, what steps can be taken to prevent a military context of which the issue must be disastrous to all parties? There lies before us, if we choose, continual progress in happiness, knowledge, and wisdom. Shall we instead choose death because we cannot forget our quarrels? We appeal as human beings to human beings. Remember your humanity and forget the rest.
If I could just add a quick note. One experience I recently had with visiting Nagasaki this year, a survivor said that even before the existence of these weapons, people were throwing stones at each other. So even if we get rid of these nuclear weapons, we would find a way to harm each other. It doesn't need to be nuclear weapons. And I think that's the real problem that Josei Toda, who I mentioned to you about, the root cause of nuclear weapons needs to change, a fundamental change in the human heart to really see and treasure the dignity of life. And once again, the motto that is cherished at my high school, which is to never build your own happiness upon others' misfortune. So if you, I think at the end of this discussion, if you still go home and say, I have nothing to do with nuclear weapons, or I'm not a nuclear expert, or I never will be, I think for myself, I would fail as a panelist, because I think that the real cause of nuclear weapons is not when we think beyond the weapons and come back to what is really the fundamental problem. It is the heart that we can justify that somebody's life is greater than another. So I think in this regard, we can all play a role, whether it be nuclear weapons or bullying or being disrespectful to somebody. I think that nuclear weapons, getting rid of nuclear weapons starts from our behavior in our day-to-day life. Thank you.
And I just add one very short thing to that, which is, I think that the logic of banning nuclear weapons is not to unlearn them and how to make them. In fact, many of the weapons we have banned, we also still know how to make them and use them. And not just weapons, but also other things that have been abolished, like slavery or capital death in some countries, are things that we know can still happen. And I think that the logic of banning weapons is more to make them less likely to happen in unintended ways, rather than to ensure that we never again, see them. I think it's more minimizing the risk of things going wrong.
Thank you very much. Next question.
I'm Jacob Diener from North Selkirk, and just tying into Eddie's question, So would we ever be able to like separate nuclear energy from nuclear weapons? Because at least by my understanding, all these nuclear armed states have nuclear power. And from the presentations that we had from a school yesterday, nuclear energy is quite beneficial, at least in the climate regards, producing tons of energy at a low fuel cost, but there is the high initial cost to build these reactors. But sorry. But what I was really wondering is, would we, due to proliferation, can we separate these, like separate the idea of building nuclear power plants in these lesser developed countries from them building weapons? Franco touched on it a bit, but with like not being able to unlearn how to make weapons, but reduce them. But I think that's the general fear of why we don't have nuclear power around the world, reducing climate change, because it's the fear of the building of the nuclear weapons in these other countries. So I was just hoping some panelists could address that.
Yeah, I think it's important, really important for us to understand that nuclear power is not the answer to the climate crisis. It is an extraordinarily expensive way of generating electricity. And every dollar that we spend on nuclear power is essentially a dollar diverted from the real solution, which is the further development of conservation, efficiency, solar power, wind power. The electricity that you get from nuclear power, that same dollar you get 5 times as much by adopting these other strategies for the climate crisis. And so the push to build more nuclear power plants is really exacerbating the climate crisis. It's diverting resources that need to be used to fight the climate crisis. And that's only one of the problems with nuclear power. The other one that is most important is the one you're alluding to, which is the intrinsic relationship between the technology involved in nuclear power production and nuclear weapons production. Essentially, any country that has the ability to run a nuclear power program has the potential to develop nuclear weapons as well. The technologies are that closely allied, and it becomes a further burden on the international system to monitor the rate of the fissile material produced in those nuclear power plants and make sure that it does not get used as a weapon. So the presentation that was made yesterday did show that there is a smaller carbon footprint from the operation of the nuclear power plant. It didn't look at what the impact is going to be on our overall carbon production if we invest in nuclear versus renewables. And I think that's really the way we need to look at this. The nuclear power industry is trying desperately to position itself as the solution. Their efforts are as dishonest, frankly, as their previous assertions that nuclear power was clean and too cheap it would be so cheap that you wouldn't be able to meter it.
Just quick, 2 additional points on that in full agreement with. One is that we're seeing right now the weaponization of nuclear plants. Zaporizhzhia in Ukraine is the most compelling and concerning example of that. And the second issue that is in no way adequately addressed as yet is waste storage. And in Canada, we have an unfortunate practice of storing a good amount of nuclear waste on Indigenous lands.
Thank you, Senator. Thank you very much. Next question, please. Microphone here.
Hello. Sorry. My name is Keith Dior. I'm coming from Phillips Exeter along with my companion Christopher Throb. But essentially, one of my questions is that, as I understand it, most of the nations that possess nuclear arms also possess like a significant role in global affairs, widespread military presence, and many enemies worldwide, which are usually kind of like similarly powerful. Inherently, this makes disarmament a finite process for nations. It makes them susceptible to the rest of the enemies who still hold nuclear arms, basically rendering them defenseless if they kind of abandon this idea of deterrence. And also, Mr. Gucci, you kind of mentioned how the kind of core idea between banning this idea of deterrence is kind of taking that first step towards peace. But my question is both how and do you think it is possible for kind of like large groups of people in all of these republics to willingly take that first step to disarm and then be at the mercy of their enemy in in the name of essentially just like global peace, or taking first steps towards that.
Is it directed to any of the panelists specifically?
No panelists in particular, maybe like Dr. Hovland or Mr. Gucci.
So I was having a little bit of trouble understanding, hearing the question, but if I understand it correctly, you're asking how is it that we can get people to take the risk of disarming and perhaps putting themselves at the mercy of other people? Is that correct?
Yeah.
So, in terms of nuclear disarmament, I think that none of the nuclear armed states are going to be willing to disarm unilaterally because of those kinds of concerns. And there's going to have to be an agreement worked out between all 9 of the countries that have nuclear weapons to disarm according to a set timetable with adequate verification that each country is meeting its obligations under the agreement, and with enforcement provisions if a country tries to cheat on the agreement. If that is done, there are still going to be some real issues because some of the countries that have nuclear weapons truly believe that their existence as a nation or the existence of the current regime is threatened. This is particularly true of Pakistan, of Israel, and of North Korea. And I think we're going to have to address those concerns as part of the negotiation process. We're going to have to provide adequate assurances to these countries that if they give up their nuclear weapons, their security will be guaranteed. Now, this has been made enormously more complicated by the situation in Ukraine, which gave up its nuclear weapons. As part of an agreement, the Russians explicitly promised to respect the territorial integrity of Ukraine. And now they have invaded the country twice, once in 2014 and again now. And this is sending an absolutely horrible message to everyone. And we're going to have to, this is part of the problem that we're dealing with right now. We're going to have to come up with some kind of an agreement with Pakistan, with North Korea, as much as we would like to see a change in the regime in North Korea, with Israel, that makes them feel that they will not be destroyed as nations if they give up their nuclear weapons. That's a challenge. It's not a reason not to do this. It's just one of the obstacles we're going to have to overcome.
Let me just add to that a very practical point. That is the crux of the Treaty for the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. That is at the heart of the treaty. And almost 2/3 of the members of the United Nations have signed on to that treaty, and it's been activated in a very short period of time compared to the other 2 treaties, which are still limping along, even though one's existed for 50+ years and the other one was from more than 25 years ago. So we don't lack for the mechanism. We lack for the action to implement the mechanism. We've done the legal work. It's there. And so that circles right back to the whole discussion about why we're here tonight and how do we shift governments. And it absolutely makes no sense for one country or 2 countries to retain nuclear weapons. And we'll always, as humans, have to live with the possibility that someone is lying. But the complete abolition of nuclear weapons, getting the nuclear powers to see this and to agree to this, is what has been articulated right from the Einstein Russell Manifesto through to today, except that today we have an activated international legal instrument that sets all of that out.
I just want to add a little something, which is, I think that for disarmament to be possible, it's important to look at a number of things. One of them is to see when it has happened. For instance, South Africa has disarmed, and there are countries like Mexico or Argentina that have the know-how to produce the weapons and the capabilities to do so. In fact, some of them attempted to produce them and then gave up that desire. So maybe it's also important to look at the circumstances in which that kind of path occurred. And the other thing is perhaps for more, not necessarily understanding the decision to disarm as a quick decision, but more of a gradual. I know some of the people who are trying to make this happen are trying to get countries to first posture themselves under a no first use policy, which, you know, if all the nuclear powers took that position and then they realized that none of them were willing to use nuclear weapons first, it also makes the decision of, okay, if no one wants to use it first, then why do we have them in the first place? So there are things like that in the logic of disarmament that I think, if it were to happen gradually, would be important to look at.
So when we're talking about trust, this is a very delicate situation because if can Russia trust America? Can America trust Russia, right? I'd like to share with you something. I took my students to Santa Barbara, California in 2019 to visit the Nuclear Age Peace Foundation. And we met with the former president of the Nuclear Age Peace Foundation, Dr. David Krieger. And in our dialogue with him and my students, this is what he had to say. And with permission, I'd like to share this with you. If you really think about it, this is Dr. Krieger, if you really think about it, deterrence cannot protect, not in the sense of physical protection. And that is the confusing part about deterrence in most people's mind. Deterrence is only a psychological concept, not a physical barrier. And then your question, and also something that relates to what we've been discussing before, we can't get rid of the knowledge of how to make nuclear weapons and probably the materials too. But I think abolition is when we have no nuclear weapons. I think we have to understand that even with no nuclear weapons, they could come back because people understand now the physics of making nuclear weapons. And I think that the way to deal with that is through verification. So the first step to abolition will be to negotiate. Secondly, it will be done in phases, increments. And with increments, you will build support and build confidence that the system is working. Verifications could be spot inspections. So if the United States says that it was down to 500 nuclear weapons and Russia says, we want to verify that, the United States, as a part of the agreement, will have to let Russian inspectors go wherever they want to and whenever they want to check whether the United States is doing what it claims and vice versa. I think negotiations, verifications, inspections, phase reductions to build confidence, all those things will help in going to zero nuclear weapons, trusting that it will lead to zero nuclear weapons. You have to trust. Ronald Reagan, one of our most conservative US presidents, said, trust, but verify. Verification is extremely important. So these are the words of Dr. David Krieger, which I'd like to share with you. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We are just coming to the end of our session, but before we go there, let me take two questions from our virtual audiences. These are short questions. So first one with no name. And the question is, I think it is directed to Mr. Guz. The question is, what does intergenerational impact look like to you, in particular incident of Hiroshima and Nagasaki?
Intergenerational, okay. You see, there are about 20 panels around us. Maybe the Zoom people can't see. And one of the panels discusses this very problem about the generation gap. The average age of Hibakshas, the A-bomb survivors, has reached 85. And I think this is a very difficult question. So how can the next generation still inherit, still understand the atrocity of the war and to continue creating value of peace, to protect peace from it, is the most difficult challenge, I think. I don't personally have an answer to this, but I'm learning from my students more and more that even if, and these are maybe 15, 16-year-old students, if they can see it within themselves that nuclear weapons relates to their life on a personal level and them taking action and feeling empowered that they can actually make a difference, that really empowers me as a teacher and as an adult. So I think that the youth, and I mentioned this earlier, they play such a vital role because it's not just going to be the politicians that change this, but I think really the awareness of civil society and for youth, the collective power of youth to bring about a change. Because I always think that, you know, why do leaders in different countries, why don't they just talk to the youth? Because they are creating the future that they will inherit. And if you talk to the youth, you would realize more and more what causes you are making. And I think this is the key to stopping, to creating our own happiness upon others' misfortune. So I think it is the power of collective youth that holds the key in nuclear disarmament.
We have two more questions from the audiences, and I think that will be our last two questions. And I'm skipping one question from our virtual audience. So let's have the next question, please.
My name is Jerry Browner, and I'm a junior psychology major from Royals College. I was wondering, because I keep hearing the conversation, or more so the topic of zero nuclear arms. I'm wondering, once we get to the point of nuclear peace, how do you think we should go about disposing it rather than the method that we've been using so far? Like, do you recommend maybe putting them in museums and things of the such, or will we be trying to actually physically dispose of it so that there's no presence whatsoever?
Do you want any particular speakers to respond?
Dr. Elfman.
Dr. Elfman? Okay.
Joe, you're going to need to repeat the very last part of your question. I couldn't hear it. I'm sorry.
Can you repeat the question, sir, once again?
Just the last part.
Last part of the question.
I was saying, what do you think would be a more efficient method of disposing of the nuclear arms once we reach nuclear peace?
How to dispose of it.
The question is how to dispose of the nuclear arms. This is a huge problem. We know how to dismantle the warheads. We know how to take the fissile material out of the configuration which can explode and to separate that material away so that it can't be put back together. But we don't know what to do with waste. This is a problem that's been referred to before. We've generated this enormous amount of radioactive material that didn't exist in nature. And it remains radioactive for an enormous period of time. In the case of plutonium, it's dangerous for 250 to 500,000 years. And we have no idea what we're going to do with this. You know, human civilization has been around for maybe 5, maybe 8,000 years. And we've created a danger that will threaten our descendants for 10 times that amount of time, for actually close to 100 times that amount of time. And we don't know what the answer is. And it's one of the problems that our nuclear physicists and nuclear scientists should be working on instead of figuring out how to build more weapons, how to get rid of the stuff that they've made already. And that's, unfortunately, that is the state at this point. We really just, there is not an answer to that question.
Last question from the floor. Please go ahead.
Hi, I'm Nex Giesbrecht. I'm a senior at River East Collegiate. This question is directed at Dr. Ira. At the beginning of the panel, you mentioned the quote, need to have people to not just know, but feel in your gut that it's a worldwide danger. Could you elaborate how we'd be able to share this information with people, or how to educate them on how this is a worldwide danger?
Yeah, that is a great question. Thank you. I think the education part in some ways is straightforward. We have the information. We know who needs to get it. The problem is communicating it and finding the way to do that. This is one way, having meetings of this sort, but this reaches a relatively small audience. We need to figure out how to mobilize the technology that disseminates information in our society to spread this information. So we need to figure out better how to use social media to get this information out, because that's the channel that especially young people really rely on for their information. We need to figure out how to get the popular culture to talk about this again. Back in the 1980s, there were movies about nuclear war, there were books about nuclear war, there were songs about nuclear war. And that's why people had nightmares about nuclear war, because it was around them all the time. And we need to figure out how to get, the motion picture industry to start helping us again, as they did then, by spreading this information. That's part of the solution. That gets the information out there. That gets us to know what the situation is. Getting us to believe it is a half step further. It's I think surrounding people so completely with this information that they just can't deny it anymore. And that sounds kind of grim. We all want to deny this. That's the reason why we do it. This is very unpleasant information. We don't like thinking about it. But what happened in the 1980s, when we did mobilize the necessary numbers of people to change policy, was just what I described. The culture became saturated with the awareness that nuclear weapons existed, were going to be used, and were going to destroy civilization. And that is what broke through people's denial and got them to take action. It's a little bit like what's happened with the climate crisis, aided there by the fact that there's daily evidence of the progression of the climate crisis, and the forest fires and the hurricanes and the floods and the droughts and so on. But largely it's because people are being told about that. Well, every day, this past year, you could not pick up a newspaper without seeing a story about the climate crisis. And it's that kind of saturation, immersion, if you will, in the problem that has gotten the kind of activity that does exist around climate, which does not yet exist around nuclear.
Thank you very much. So as we approach the absolutely the last part of our session this evening, I'd like to invite each of our distinguished panelists to share their final thoughts, reflections, or a call to action based on our discussion today. So what I'd like to offer is 2 minutes for each panelist to kindly share their final thoughts with us. And I'd like to go in a reverse direction as we started. So I'd like to first invite Mr. Kazuhiro to share his one, then we'll follow the direction as we. So go ahead, sir.
Okay, my final comments will be from my student. So she says, I learned what was truly behind the war. As I studied more and more about the war, I felt that every single person on both sides are all victims. America dropped the atomic bomb in Japan, but Japan initially attacked Pearl Harbor. We emphasize on being the victims of the A-bomb, but I came to learn that Japan also had a dark history of illegally producing poison gas as weapons. It tormented and killed many Chinese people, and even harmed the workers of the mill who were making these weapons. Who or what is behind all of this torment and misery? I think it is fundamentally hidden in the egoism and the selfishness that we all have in our minds. When we have thoughts that justify the suffering of others in order to protect oneself, that sad spirit is the true cause of war. The first step towards world peace is to overcome our own egoism and to have the strength to be considerate and caring towards others. Without this heart, we will continue to repeat the same tragedy. So as we leave today here, I hope that we can practice wisdom, courage, and compassion, and to not create our own happiness upon others' misfortune. Thank you so much.
I think for my final remarks, I would like to emphasize the creativity and diversity that I have seen in Winnipeg in the past 2 days. Since I got here 2 days ago, I've been able to meet some of the young people who met here in this very part of the museum. And I have been really impressed with the creativity of the youth that participated here. Some of them were creating visualizations of data to be able to share with a wider audience online websites. Some of them were creating clubs and goals to make their schools, their cities, their states nuclear weapon free zones. Some people were planning to write letters to their representatives. Other people wanted to create a podcast. I learned about a movie that's being made and soon to be released in the next year or so. And the list goes on. If you could see my journal that I took to Winnipeg to make notes, it's full with notes of all the ideas that were shared here. And I am simply grateful to have been invited to be here, and I look forward to seeing what else comes out of these meetings. Thank you.
I also come away from this conference with an enormously renewed sense of energy and optimism. And I truly believe, despite the grave danger and threat that we face, that we have the ability to overcome this. And the example of the involvement of young people at this event has certainly magnified my sense of optimism. There's a passage in the Hebrew Bible where it's reported that God said, "Behold, I have set before you life and death. Therefore, choose life that you and your children might live." This is literally the choice before all of humanity today. And so I think the task is for each one of us to try to choose wisely, to act with courage and determination. And if we do this, I think indeed our children will live. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm madly hand signaling here, trying to ask Avinash to bring up to show you the amazing banners that were done by students today. And I'll just share with you that a week ago today, last Friday, I was in the UN General Assembly and I was in Committee Room 4 as well, when Japan had presented its draft resolution on building a common roadmap to a world without nuclear weapons. This is a draft resolution that's been negotiated for quite some time, and it was adopted. It was amended in certain parts, but it was adopted last Friday at the very end of the day. And it will now go to the UN General Assembly as a resolution for all the countries in the world to consider. And I think that what you're seeing here from the hands and hearts and minds of students this afternoon is a demonstration of the capacity that we have as humanity to build a common roadmap to a world without nuclear weapons.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Did everybody get their phones?
Thank you very much.
What a wonderful conclusion of today's session. Thank you so much, Senator, once again for explaining and showing us so much of hope. On behalf of everyone here and those joining us virtually, I'd like to extend our heartfelt gratitude to Dr. Ira Helfland, Mr. Kazuchi, Senators Merilu McFadden, and Franco for contributing to this important dialogue this evening. A special thank you as well to our Master of Ceremony, Kevin Roebuck, and all the staff and volunteers at the Canadian Museum for Human Rights for hosting us and making this event possible. And of course, a big thank to all of you in the audience, both in person and online, for your active participation and for being a part of this important conversation. We should remember the journey towards a world free from nuclear weapons continues, and it requires our collective effort. We encourage you to stay connected, continue learning, and keep advocating for a safer and more peaceful world. Good night, and thank you for joining us.
Avinash, can we have a photo? Avinash.